Okay, please help me welcome back to the stage the director of Room 237, Rodney Ascher.
Thanks. Thank you guys. And I would like to invite my friend, partner, Tim Kirk, producer of Room 237.
Okay, so I'll start us off with a couple of questions, and I'm sure you guys have a few of your own. But take us to the beginning. Tell us, how did this project come about?
Internet addiction? No, well, I mean, Tim and I have always been lifelong Kubrick fans with a special warm spot in our hearts for The Shining. And, you know, there was a day, maybe two and a half years ago, where Tim posted an online analysis of The Shining to my Facebook page, one that really kind of blew me away. And almost instantly I was like, this could make a pretty interesting movie. You know, maybe it's only 20 minutes long, but as much as I love reading this analysis, I love to see it with the pictures and like all kinds of other elements to go bigger. And then the two of us started researching what else had been written about The Shining, because I think right away it seemed like incorporating multiple points of view would be much more interesting than, well, this one guy's take. And it wasn't as if I had, you know, this personal metaphorical reading of The Shining. I wanted to round up, you know, what was out there. And we were kind of amazed and kind of delighted that, you know, we opened up this Pandora's box of thousands, an endless number of things and theories jumped out, and it became very clear very early that this was a pretty rich something or other to mine.
Yeah, at one point I had a spreadsheet where I was trying to keep track of every theory and put them in sort of columns and things, and that got crumpled up and thrown away pretty early on in the project.
So how did you decide on these subjects?
Well, I mean, there's sort of different criteria for different folks here. Certainly there had been a handful of ideas about what The Shining is really about that had been kind of widely discussed. You know, the moon landing thing and the Native Americans, I think, come to mind first for a lot of people. So it was very important that those would get reflected. So if anybody said, you know, I'm curious about, you know, the metaphorical readings of The Shining, how do they all go? That those two would be covered, and that you know, and that we'd be able to probe them and spend a little bit of time. And then from there, we found other people who came at it from very different directions. Certainly they had to be folks who had written a lot, because I didn't want this to be something where 100 people had one thing to say, but that a smaller group of people had a lot to say, and we gave them room to, you know, really go kind of deep. And then something that happened right away from the first interview was that most everyone also had these really strong personal connections, both the way they related to the ideas of Stanley Kubrick, but that their work thinking about The Shining had kind of affected their lives. So it was important that everybody we talked to kind of had that as well, and that nobody was just dryly saying, well, this means that, and this means that, and we're done. If they didn't have that kind of passionate personal connection, it wasn't quite as interesting. Yeah.
Questions from the audience?
Did you pay Warner Brothers to use the footage of the film, and if so, how much?
Did you have to pay Warner Brothers for the film?
We went through a big clearance process with a team of lawyers and experts on this, and we paid for some clips, and others we used under a different understanding, but I can't really talk about numbers and things.
Yep.
Did you ever ask each of the interpreters to comment on each other's theories?
Not unless, you know, it kind of came up organically in the process of it. Though what wound up becoming really interesting was when, for one reason or another, one person's theory would sort of overlap on another's. Like there's a moment where I think I had explained to Jeffrey Cox, who talks about the World War II stuff, the way John Fell Ryan looks at those dissolves, and that how it's more than a transition, but in that space of time, while we're still looking at both shots, he's creating a juxtaposition in a relationship between those images, and he just immediately went to that thing with the suitcases and the people dissolving into them. And he was like, oh, I can see how that technique would lead to this point. And in a similar note, there's that scene near the end where where we see that Hitler mustache in the course of that dissolve, and John Phil Ryan, who looks at those dissolves and did the forwards backwards thing, didn't necessarily have a ton to say about Hitler and World War II themes, but looking at it through his eyes, we were able to find something more that supported what Jeffrey was saying.
We're hoping at some point to get all 5 of these people together in the same room, maybe on a stage of a Q&A after of a film. Jeffrey and Bill were both at Sundance, and so they met, and I had dinner with them, and they became huge friends and huge fans of each other's work, and they're corresponding and plotting something.
Inside there?
So, having been exposed to all these different theories and whatnot, do you have any opinions?
Well, I mean, there's something in what each of these folks say that really dramatically changes the way I look at that I look at this movie. And they've all pointed out anomalies that seem to be much more meaningful than just random chance or errors. I'm certainly not going to say that theory A is right and theory B is not right. And of course, that sort of thing is unknowable, because there's both the question of the riddle of trying to find out what Kubrick really intended. Not that he would necessarily have shared that with anyone. I know there's an interview with him where he describes the Mona Lisa and says, this thing wouldn't be improved with a plaque on the bottom that says, "This is the expression on her face is because she's thinking about a past lover," assuming that's what it's about, because that would kind of force people to look at it through his way. So since Kubrick's intentions are arguably unknowable, and as Jeffrey points out, in some ways beside the fact. I know the director of Nightmare on Elm Street 2, if you're watching the director's commentary, seemed to have been unaware that he was creating a parable about a teenager trapped in the closet. Nonetheless, that's a totally relevant way to look at the movie.
I'm just pretty confused at this point.
Is anyone involved in the actual production of The Shining senior film?
I don't think so, not yet. And it was important from the outset. Not that it would have been easy or maybe even possible to have talked to them while we were, working on this, crazy little video in the early stages. But we never wanted, to involve any of them at the outset. We didn't want. We kind of wanted to. Really narrow the focus to what happens, when a movie leaves the hands of the filmmakers and gets into the minds of the audience, and what happens to it there. Now that this thing is, more or less wrapped up, except for a little bit of the paperwork, it would be endlessly fascinating to talk to some of those folks. Ask Jack Nicholson where that magazine came from.
Towards the end of the film, you got into, I guess, it was Mastermind. Did you guys get feedback on, I guess, why they didn't want to be involved with the film?
Well, sure. I mean, I talked to the Mastermind, for a half hour or so, and would have loved to have included that conversation in the film, because he's just a fascinating guy and so much smarter than I am. But I think his reservation was that he doesn't see The Shining as a movie that has any ambiguity in it at all. He knows, he's watched it and he's taken it apart, and he knows what that movie is about, and doesn't necessarily think that his work will be helped by my putting it in context with other people's work. I would absolutely recommend, people who want to dive deeper into this rabbit hole to check out his site. I think a search for Mastermind Kubrick and leave all the vowels out of Mastermind will get you there.
And there's a lot there. There's a lot to read.
Besides the Shining footage, you exclusively footage from films to put this together. Can you just talk a little bit about what might be facts of these?
Yeah, well, I had done a short, a few years before that technically was done in kind of a similar way. And there's something I really liked about, working in that collage style, sort of a, taking cues from both, essay films and YouTube films or mashups or even like Bruce Conner kind of montage films. And I got really fascinated, and I wound up doing more of it than we had originally intended. I had imagined doing a pretty elaborate production of, Stanley Kubrick meeting with Pentagon brass. But it got really, it became a game and an exercise I was really interested in, once I was able to, get particular characters to represent more than one person. Like if Jack Nicholson sometimes represents Jack Nicholson and sometimes represents Jack Torrance and sometimes represents Stanley Kubrick and sometimes represents Bill Blakemore and sometimes represents me or, an audience member. And that became like a challenge that I wanted to take as far as I could and to see how far I could push that in that while the audience could kind of stay with it. Sort of this weird, maybe version of the Kuleshov effect. And since, these people are all obsessing so focusedly on a movie, when we talk about movies in general, kind of to set this, in some set kind of virtual planet of the movies, seem to do some kinds of interesting things.
And if you get a chance, you should watch Rodney's short film called The S from Hell. I think you can find it on Vimeo.
Yeah, it's not hard to find on.
But anyway, it's definitely the child from which this grew up to be. It's a great film.
Thanks.
We have time for a couple more questions. Anyone have a great one? Yeah.
I know you said that Kubrick never really talked about where he's coming through, but did he ever comment on the obsession that this film spawned? Did he ever?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I think he during his lifetime, I found much more references to him responding to people who would talk about 2001, and reportedly he was always kind of entertained when people would tell him what the movie was really about, and certainly wouldn't confirm or deny anything. Although Bill Blakemore wrote his first thing about the Native Americans in 1987, and it was pretty widely syndicated in American newspapers, I kind of see this sort of hardcore, deep drilling into The Shining to be kind of a more recent phenomenon. And what was surprising and kind of amazing is how much of this stuff has been, like how quickly the pace has been increasing. Even in the time it took to make this film, more and more stuff started coming out of the woodwork. In fact, the John Phil Ryan, who does the forwards backwards thing that dissolves, didn't even start his KDK12 Tumblr site where he posts every time a character is smoking a cigarette in The Shining, every dissolve in The Shining, the eerie similarities between The Shining and Poltergeist, maps that, there's a map that where he traces the paths that people walk through the hotel and its eerie similarity to the Big Dipper and what the metaphorical implications of that are. And he didn't even start that Tumblr until our film was well into production. For some reason, 32 years later, The Shining was a time bomb, and it's really just starting to go off now. So I don't know that I've certainly never heard of Kubrick being confronted, with this kind of body of work.
Last question.
In your opinion, when did him adopting in the first place? Did you expect it to work? Or was that
I mean, I thought about that, and I've kind of thought that there must have been something about it that just really captured him and spoke to him. But like almost all of his films, he'll take a text and sort of work against it, So I think he was doing that here. But I don't know. I assume if you ask, we'll have to ask these guys.
Well, and one thing I've read about, certainly one thing I've read about, Stanley Kubrick, is how important his family was to him, and that he did not really live, an insane, debauched, Hollywood kind of lifestyle. That, he worked a lot out of his house and spent a lot of time with his family. And, certainly me and Tim, who, both have small children, relate really strongly to John Paul Ryan at the end of this, seeing Jack Torrance as a cautionary version of us and as an anti-role model. That, this, it's very easy to, try to square some of these ideas against what you know of Stanley Kubrick, what you think about him. And, I'm not the first person to think that, this is some sort of story about the importance of family and, separating, work and life and that sort of thing. And it's clearly a drama about, a father who is struggling to reconcile, his creative life and his responsibilities to his family. And this is what happens when you make the wrong choice.
Well, none of us will ever watch The Shining in the same way again. And thank you so much for bringing the film. Thank you everybody for coming. It's a great festival. Thank you.
This has been amazing.